So you as you all know, this is not the usual time. This is something unprecedented what we are seeing day in day out, which we hadn't seen since our which our even our parents have not seen this kind of era. And because of the new onset of emergencies and all this medical infrastructure being overwhelmed by just COVID, let alone other diseases, so we see patients missing their day-to-day appointments as well as their regular follow-ups. Even the surgeries they have gone from an elective point of view to only emergency surgeries. That to the patient, it is the surgeon, the condition becomes an emergency. At that level, they'll come to the hospital. So at this time, the whole medical infrastructure has changed. Even we, as medical students, we have seen that we have changed our classes from our academics have shifted from classrooms to Zoom meetings right now. So even this is how we have started adapting to the pandemic, and this pandemic most probably is going to slowly mutate to a level, and it's going to become endemic after a period of time, and it is going to continue to have its waxing and waning as we are recently have suffered the second wave, and third wave, fourth wave might come in. Because if we go by history, the last pandemic was Spanish flu, which occurred during 1914 to 1918, which itself had around 3 to 4 spikes, and it killed more than 100 million people. So if you're going by that extent, it will take a little bit more time for us to come out of this pandemic. But as we are seeing now, the cases have come down drastically, and hopefully the third wave will more prepared for that. And the other thing from other side I would want to tell is that our lives are going to be changed after this. The no longer the people at themselves are medically more equipped right now. They have little bit more knowledge because they have to take care, and they will start depending on you people. Let it be dental people, let it be medicine people. You'll start having expectations at home. So my aim currently is going to be this. So that each and every small thing right now is going to help us out. And just the ability to identify and understand the warning red flags and helping the sick patients to proper medical help is of paramount importance right now. My aim of this topic is to just to equip you and give you a brief overview of how things are happening. And basically, because you're dental students, you have to identify little basic emergency scenarios and common medical emergencies and how to respond it if it is there, or at least identify them at a local point of view and direct them to a hospital. Okay, because patients nowadays are even worried of going to a hospital until and unless it's an emergency. So if you are able to identify, and patients having worried that if they go to the hospital they'll catch COVID, and they don't know the importance of that issue. So we being medical students will be able to, at least if we are able to guide them to the hospital, or tell this is a life emergency situation, you need to get out of the house and go to the hospital. That itself is like serves my purpose. If someone of you down the line helping down your lifetime, if it is able to help you, that would be more than enough for me. So, how are we going to go out, around this topic? So, the basic contents are going to be ABC about emergency, basic hypertension versus hypotension, diabetes. Then we are going to go around acute coronary syndrome, choking of any foreign body. Then stroke, how to identify any seizure patient. Then I'm going to take a little bit 10 minutes regarding the pandemic and how it occurs, because anything apart from this, you might occur, you might not occur. But pandemic, which is going around, you have to understand what is the patient is on steroids, patient is on antivirals. You might be hearing about remdesivir. All these medications might look uh, little bit confusing right now. So I'll try to ease up that. So what stage, what we give, and how we proceed for that, and how we are seeing patients. You might be hearing that patients overnight are going on to ICU ventilators. So what is happening at molecular level, as well as what is happening in their bodies, which people are not able to identify, unlike other diseases where they were able to identify. The last thing is I would like to tell a little bit about the vaccination and how to identify any emergency situation will be also there. Okay. So this is a disclaimer I wanted to tell, because remember, in medicine, this is one thing I wanted to put across is, in medicine, 1 plus 1 is not equal to 2. It is 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, 3, 4, 5. That is medicine. It is a vast ocean. Even we as doctors, or even as senior consultants for 30, 40 years of experience, they have their own issues. as in medical knowledge keeps on expanding, medical knowledge keeps on changing day to day. What we were using HCPS previously has become totally obsolete right now. What plasma therapy we were using previously has become obsolete right now. So all these things said and done, I don't want you to like, it doesn't replace any medical advice or diagnosis or treatment. If there is any medical treatment, you have to have a medical consultant or a doctor with a proper degree to have a look at this. The only aim is to just identify the signs better than a non-medical person. Okay. So with this, I wanted to start with what is a medical emergency. Medical emergency is basically a sudden, urgent, and unusual, unexpected occurrence requiring immediate action, and it can be life-threatening. Anyone can identify a patient who is sick, who is fallen down. These are the things. But what, as medical professional, we have to identify is to identify the basic signs of life. That is the vital signs. You already might have known in your BDS first year is that basic heart rate. Normal heart rate is around 72 beats per minute, but more than 110 or 90 is supposed to be a tachycardia, which is the fast rapid heart rate, and bradycardia. Bradycardia means less heart rate, which we see some people tend to have, like athletes tend to have a normal basal heart rate of less than like around 60, but anything in the 50s or less than 50 is called as bradycardia. This is again an emergency situation because the heart beating at a lower rate might tend to cause the clotting in the heart and thereby leading to any cardiac issues. Blood pressure, as you all know, you might have already learned how to take measure a blood pressure using a sphygmomanometer. Nowadays everything has been changed, so checking the patient's blood pressure is the second most important thing what you have to check whenever you see a patient who is having an emergency situation. Third is the respiratory rate. Respiratory rate is the amount of breathing he does, taking a deep inspiration as well as an expiration. That is total combined is called as its one's respiratory cycle. So normally the patient will have 14 to 16 respiratory cycle per minute. But especially this becomes of paramount importance right now because of the pandemic. The patient will have he'll not feel breathless. He'll be stable. He'll be telling that I'm not having any breathing problem. But you have to see that if he's having a shallow breathing, like he's breathing at a faster rate, that also is a sign that he's subclinically there is something issue which is going on. We have to identify that is the that identification of that sign will give us golden period that we'll have a better chance of saving that patient compared to other patients who will come later on when they actually start feeling breathless. Now it's in the recent past, being a pulmonologist, now there is a previously there was no fourth vital sign. Now it has come to origin. That is oxygen saturation using pulse oximeter. Just like how thermometer, a BP apparatus has become very common in the household right now, even a pulse oximeter has become of a paramount importance right now. So basically, you have to identify the patient, and now because of the pandemic, there is a lot of patients we are seeing with decreased oxygen levels without any breathlessness. These are actually more riskier than those patients who start to feel breathless. At least the patients, they feel breathless, they'll come to a hospital an earlier point of time. The earlier they come, the earlier the aggressive we can manage them. Whereas those patients who end up in the suddenly overnight come to the ICUs are the patients who don't monitor their oxygen levels. Okay. So especially during COVID era, we have to identify the saturation of the patient using a pulse oximeter. So I would ask you people to just have at least have a pulse oximeter at home, all of you, for the sake of any emergency anytime. You have to have a sort of a emergency kit in which also a pulse oximeter should always be there. And how you, it's better always to have a pulse oximeter from a standard company rather than having something which is like coming off the market, which is very cheap. Because I've recently had a patient in my OP whose pulse oximeter was faulty, and she had spent the whole day roaming other hospitals, spending almost 10,000 bucks, getting a CT and all the evaluation done, just because she does not know that her pulse oximeter was showing a faulty reading. So we don't want that to happen, especially in an emergency situation. So it would be always better to buy some pulse oximeter which is from a branded company. Okay. But coming to the ABCs of medical emergency, ABC meaning the basics, as well as we have the same thing in our patients. What we need to see, that is the first thing is to airway, breathing, and circulation. These are the mainstay of every patient you see in an emergency. Is the patient, if the patient has collapsed in front of you, is he breathing? Is his airway patent? Airway as in the throat, your trachea, and as well as his lungs. So if there is any issue in the upper airways, as in he might have a tongue fall, or he might be choking on something, you have to see that is the airways clear, or if he's breathing, or circulation is the part where you check for the heart rate as well as the blood pressure. So what happens when you see that these three things are not in line, that the patient is not breathing, the circulation is not there, you have to first check for the airway, clear it up. If there is any obstruction, you have to clear it out. Then you have to check for the breathing and circulation. If the breathing is there and the circulation is there, you have to take him to the hospital immediately. If the breathing and circulation is not there, then you have to immediately identify. As you can see in the current slide, in the first part, you can see that the patient, the attender, the emergency responder is trying to assess if there is any heart rate, heartbeat, as well as any breathing by lung expansion. If it is not present, she's clasping her hands in a pattern that you have to clasp it like this around your sternum. Then you have to have your elbows flexed, elbows extended, and you have to start using the jerky motions. And the compression should be started. She's trying to check for there any obstruction in the airway after that, and she's trying to give that mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Mind you, the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation is not, we are not giving oxygen. A lot of people have to have confusion that why are we breathing carbon dioxide into it. You have to understand that our brain has a sensor for high oxygen as well as carbon dioxide, and based on the body oxygen levels, it will identify if the oxygen and carbon dioxide is less and will trigger the respiratory cycle and to make it restart, to basically restart it. So as we are breathing air inside their mouth, we are breathing out carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is more potent trigger for the brain to start breathing compared to oxygen, and that is the only thing which we can get at that time. So you have to continuously maintain this, and it is always better to call up someone and have someone surrounding to inform them and start compressions, so that you can interchange along with them. And always, because the patient, whenever he has collapsed, his tongue will mostly fall on his throat, and which will cause what you call airway collapse. So we have to always open the airway by lifting the chin slightly and pinch the nose and give rescue breaths. For an adult, it is very important that because by the sternum, you're doing cardiac massage. You're trying to push the heart to start pumping the blood out. So you have to perform at least 30 compressions at the rate of 100 per minute. So this is very exhausting, and you have to do it press down with 2 inches and let the chest come up. Okay. And when it comes to even an infant, you have to do it with the 2 fingers, and it is around 1.5 inches. And this is the basic CPR technique. Almost everyone should have this, and they tend to run ACLS, artificial life support certification classes. If it is around your place or around your hospital, these people are conducting this kind of ACL certification. It is always better to for your CV as well as for your medical practice, as well as for your basic supporting your family members whenever required. If you have done this certification, it will be always helpful for us, so that we will be able to help anyone during their emergency. Now coming to hypertension, the second topic. So normal blood pressure, we know, we have measured, almost everyone knows that the BP should be 120 by 80. The issue with hypertension right now is India being a hypertensive as well as a diabetic capital, it is an iceberg disease. Until and unless the patient gets it checked, people don't know. Like how you have this in this iceberg, 90% of the iceberg will be below the water and only 10% will be above the water. So if you are having 100 patients, out of 100 patients, only 10 patients will be getting it treated, and out of those 10 patients, only 5 patients will be having it correctly treated. Remaining 90% of the patients, they don't even know that they are having hypertension, and they will end up with end organ damage. Chronically having hypertension over a period of time will cause the end organ damage, as in the continuously, because of the excessive pressure hitting your organs, they will have persistent damage, and this damage doesn't come overnight. It will have it over a period of years. You might be listening to some patients, they were sleeping in their night, they had a stroke. So underlying, they might be having hypertension which was never diagnosed, and overnight, because of the continuous pressure over a period of years and having a stress trigger at that point of time, might have precipitated it. So what is hypertension and how does it affect? Hypertension basically is the same thing what I was talking previously, is the elevation of BP more than 130/80. That is for static patients. So that can be diagnosed in an OP. But nowadays, because I've already told, a pandemic situation is not allowing the patients to come for a regular checkup. These patients tend to continue to have hypertension and will develop hypertensive emergencies. So what are hypertensive emergencies? You have two hypertensive, this is called as hypertensive crisis. Okay, hypertensive crisis is the elevation of BP to a higher level, more than around 200, 220 systolic, whereas diastolic might be more than 120. So in this, again, you have two different hypertensive emergencies. So one is hypertensive emergency and hypertensive urgency. What is hypertensive emergency? Hypertensive emergency again is BP more than 220 by 120, but you will have end organ damage. End organ damage as in the BP will be elevated plus or minus this level, but you will have either, if the patient, if the BP is that high, they will have brain stroke, elevated BP with brain stroke, elevated BP with lung damage as in pulmonary edema. They suddenly have blindness, disturbed vision because the blood supply to the eye gets damaged. They have a clot in, they have a bleeding in their brain because of the elevated BP. This again is due to that. Sometimes the patients, because of the elevated hypertension, will have damage to their kidneys. They end up with kidney injury. These are all symptoms. Elevated BP plus this other organs also getting involved. This is called as hypertensive emergency. And on the other hand, you have hypertensive urgency, in which the patient will have elevated BP, but they will not showing any other. They won't show any other symptoms like end organ damage. They will be stable in front of you. They'll be having a BP of 220. They'll be sitting like that. So for both of these require emergency involvement more or less, because you have to decrease the blood pressure slowly. You should not never, the BP at this level should be decreased drastically. Even when you go to a hospital, the doctors will take over a period of 24 hours to slowly decrease the BP, because suddenly you're stopping the blood supply to your brain. The brain will get more damage compared to just trying to help him out. Okay, the patient with hypertension, they are, the main thing is that they don't show symptoms unless and until they have a very extreme cases. In the case of any pulmonary edema, you see the fluid getting accumulated in the lungs, you'll have shortness of breath. If they tend to have heart attack or myocardial infarction, you will see chest pain. They will have persistent fatigue, that is weakness, and headache if you're seeing a patient with stroke. And increased heartbeat will also be seen, and they'll start having palpitations. Mostly it is caused because of endocrine problems, heart problems, long periods of heat. That is who will have this hypertensive emergency. Would be just more than any adult more than 65 years, and especially patients with a family history, alcohol usage again, patients being persistently immobile, that is bedridden, patients with diabetes because they tend to have silent MIs also. How to prevent this is to first identify that the patient is having blood pressure by getting recurrent, like every 6 monthly checkup, or you are able to check it at home with a patient having proper family history. To have to recurrently keep on checking the BP over a period of time, at least monthly once. Have decrease your salt in your don't completely remove potassium, sodium in your sodium in your food. Just try to decrease it less than 1 gram per day, and limit alcohol movement consumption, and avoid quick movement. So what do you, what sorry, I was reading out there. So what I want you to do is, whenever you have patient with this elevation, more than 220, and if the patient is stable also, you have to take them to a hospital only. You don't try to put any medication immediately, so that it will cause the drop of medication, drop the BP drastically, thereby causing the patient to have a sudden drop in the BP, thereby causing another medical emergency. So identify the hypertension, take the patient to a hospital, or if you're having any medical professional who knows currently, who's on teleconsultation, you'll be able to take the help of the medical consultant and start the medications. And if the patient has missed the medication, ask the doctor and restart the medications. Don't try to give something orally also at that time, because they might tend to aspirate if they suddenly lose consciousness. And coming to the hypotension on the other side, um, hypotension is again the same thing. You have a BP less than 90 systolic. This is generally very commonly seen in thin females, and working women also, who tend to exert themselves. And this again also is of very high importance, because hypotension is sort of another way of going the patient going into shock. The patients will have giddiness as well as lightheadedness, and sometimes because of the low blood pressure, the blood supply to the brain might decrease and the brain might go into a blackout, thereby causing the patient to fall. So this is a natural mechanism for the patient to help himself. As in, whenever the patient is standing upright, the heart has to pump the blood against the gravity. So when the blood pressure is low to the brain, the reflex mechanism is to shut down the brain, thereby causing the patient to fall down on the ground. So once he falls down on the ground, he might have a head injury, but his blood pressure will improve because the gravity, now the heart does not have to pump the against the gravity. So whenever you see a patient who is hypotensive, always make him to lie down. That is why majority of the patients who have hypertension will survive at home. But these kind of patients we tend to see in mass events like Mela or somewhere you have mass people where there's no place to lie around. These kind of patients die there because there is no area for the patient to lie down or the patient to fall down. So that kind of thing tends to happen. So always the first thing when the patient is having hypotension is to ask him to lie down. You can give him some fluids, oral fluids, and generally based on their trigger factor. Sometimes the patients might have continuous loose stools or vomitings, dehydration, or sometimes, as I've already told, working in the heat, exhausting themselves. Even we are seeing in pregnancy, sometimes because of the infection due to the septic, the blood becoming septic and the patient going into septic shock. This is also reason. So it is better always to have a medical practitioner to identify the cause of hypotension. And because hypotension will cause the blood supply of organs to come down, it is an emergency situation because the organs not as the BP keeps on coming down, the blood supply to the organ starts decreasing, thereby causing the organs to shut down, which is again will might cause of if the BP, blood pressure to the kidney shut down, it causes kidney failure, or sometimes the liver gets damaged. All these things are there. So always hypotension, identify it by checking the pulse of the patient. The pulse mostly is very feeble. It might not be that bounding as we see in a hypertensive patient. And the peripheries, because the blood supply is decreasing, the peripheries or the hands and the legs will be cold. Okay. So coming to the next topic, which is diabetes. Diabetes, just like hypertension, the patient doesn't come to know until and unless he keeps on checking his sugar levels, or he tends to have some septic infection. Thereby retrograde, they might be getting a test done where they will be able to identify that they are suffering from diabetes. And it is a chronic condition, basically. It is, unlike other diseases, diabetes will not be going overnight. You have to take the medication or the insulin over a prolonged period of time, and slowly, if there is mild type of diabetes which can be managed by lifestyle management on the parallel, you might be able to clear it out. But more or less it will be always on continuous medications and insulin. Sometimes what we tend to see in our family members or patients is they tend to skip the meals and take the insulin, in which the patient tends to drastically have a drop in their sugar, with thereby causing hypoglycemia, which is hypo meaning less, glycemia means sugar. Or sometimes the patient tend to forget their insulin or the medication, thereby causing the sugar levels to rise beyond 300, thereby causing hyperglycemia. Both these conditions are of long-term management of the diabetes will be a problem for these kind of patients who tend to not take care of themselves. And especially when the patient is sick because of COVID or some other issue, they tend to also go through this. And with the onset of steroids nowadays, you might be already knowing that steroids will increase the sugar levels. Thereby, these patients will be having higher level of sugars. And how do you identify between hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia? Because BP, you'll be able to immediately check. Sometimes you might not have a glucometer at your house. So how do you identify? So hypoglycemia might be because if the patient is on insulin and he takes too much of insulin, or takes insulin and does not eat food, thereby causing the sugar level to drop. Or they tend to exercise too much that the sugar levels again drop. Or sometimes what happens is they might be eating food properly, but they might have vomitings or loose stools, thereby causing lot of depletion of the fluids as well as the sugars, thereby causing hypoglycemia. On the other hand, when you see hyperglycemia is mostly seen in diabetic patients only, which we are seeing the patient, they tend to leave the insulin out, they have excessive food consumption, especially the carbohydrates, or the patients having sudden infection or digestive disturbances, thereby causing a disturbance in the sugar levels by causing the disturbances in the liver, thereby causing gluconeogenesis, thereby creating more amount of sugar in their body. And the main thing you have to identify is the hyperglycemia never tends to occur overnight. The patient slowly might be having a lot of poor sugar control over a period of time, and sudden event might precipitate the hyperglycemia. On the other hand, hypoglycemia is more or less always the patient rapidly deteriorates. The patient will be all right in the morning, suddenly he or she will skip a meal, take more insulin, suddenly she'll have a total, she might become unconscious because of the hypoglycemia. And the signs also you can identify is the pale, cold, clammy skin. And in hypoglycemia, you tend to have sympathetic overactivity, thereby causing the patient will be having a lot of sweating. Literally, because of the hypoglycemia, his shirt will be literally wet with sweat. So this is a very important sign you can identify in a patient. You see the similar symptoms in a patient who's having a heart attack, but hypoglycemic diabetic patients who's having sweating, the first thing you have to check is to have is how much his sugar is. You can, if he's conscious and awake, you can immediately give some chocolate or some sugar or sugar water. This will help him slowly improve his sugar levels. Thereafter, we can take the patient to a medical professional. And sometimes the patient will have normal breathing, normal or shallow breathing, shallow rapid breathing. The patient will be irritable, confused, uncoordinated, and will have sort of aggressive behavior because there is a less glucose in his brain. Thereby, this might be causing him to act like that. And the patient will also have tremors in his hands. Palpitations also will be seen. Whereas coming to hyperglycemia, the patient will have flushed, hot, dry skin, rapid pulse, low. They tend to, because of the elevated sugar levels, they have low blood pressures. They will have, because if they go into ketoacidosis, which are even more serious level of hyperglycemia, that is ketosis, the fruity breath in odor will be seen. They will, the more the sugar in their body, the more urination they will have, the more thirst they will have, the more uh, excessive they will try to have intake of food, restless, drowsy, or lethargic behavior. And if the patient tends to be without any medical attention, they might even go to diabetic coma, which is another emergency situation. So what I want you to take home from this slide is to identify that hypoglycemia occurs over a period of within minutes to hours, whereas hyperglycemia will take amount of time. And if you're checking the blood level, if you have a glucometer, which is again what I want you people to have at home, the because millimole is 18, 1 millimole equal to 18 mg per day. 18 is uh, 22. So you have if the sugar levels is more than 360, that is coming under hyperglycemia, where on the opposite side you have less than 60 GRBS, that means the patient is having hypoglycemia. So you have to immediately administer the glucose to them. Okay. Glucose, as in if the patient is awake, you have to take orally. If the patient is unconscious, then you might need to just take him to the hospital. But if you are able to do, just you can sprinkle a little bit of sugar water in the mouth. And hyperglycemia, don't try to confuse both. So if you're having a patient who's having hyperglycemia, then you give sugar to them, that will even more deteriorate the condition of patient. I've seen patients who are coming to the hospital thinking that they were having less sugar, but on the contrary, they were having elevated sugar levels, thereby causing the patient to have more amount of sugar at home, or their attenders administering them more sugar, thereby causing even more damage to their body. Okay, so you're identifying is the key, as well as having a glucometer at home is very important. Coming to the third topic, which is myocardial infarction or the heart attack, it is because of impairment of heart function. That is, the blood supply of the heart is stopped. That is, the coronary vessels of the heart, they have obstruction because of thrombus. Thrombus means clot. Plaque means the fat around the blood vessel that coming off, or that fat getting more deposited more and more, and causing the total obstruction of the vessel, or sometimes the vessel is, that is called as angina. So as you have seen in the photo, this is the typical presentation the patient will have. He will have a hand on his chest, and he will be having breathlessness as well as chest pain relating to the jaw. Okay, chest pain originating from the left side of the chest, going towards the arm or towards the neck and the jaw. Sometimes they tend to even vomit. Sometimes they even have loss of consciousness. The pain is stabbing type of pain and is of high intensity, making the patient to just abruptly stop whatever he's doing and just lie down. And the pain tends to increase and come in a spasmodic manner also. Sometimes the pain is so high, the patient won't even able to talk or shout for help. And how do you see? That is acute central chest pain not responding to nitrates, or pain radiating to the left side or the left arm, associated with profuse sweating, breathlessness, palpitation, and sometimes the patient will collapse in front of you. But the thing what we need to identify is some patients, especially diabetic patients, as I already told, because of the persistent high sugar in their body, their nerves tend to have the nerves will tend to become numb. That is, long standing high sugar levels will cause the nerves to have neuropathy, thereby not have the patients will not have the chest pain as we are seeing in a normal patient. So chest pain, the patient will immediately go to hospital. Whereas the diabetic patient, they won't have any chest pain, they'll just have sweating and palpitations. We might confuse it with hypoglycemia, but it can be heart attack also. So that is why you don't take a decision on your own. You have to go to a hospital and ask them to immobilize, reassure, ask them to sit at a semi sitting position, because of the breathlessness, they won't be able to lie down. They'll be just getting up if you are asking them to lie down. That means that they are breathless, because in hypoglycemia, you don't see breathlessness that more or less. Whereas you can see that the patient is having difficulty to breathe in a myocardial infarction. So you have to monitor the pulse and the saturation and CPR if the patient has collapsed. But coming to the males and females, you might have little bit of discrepancy in the symptoms. The typical symptoms, what I've told, seen in the males. And females, you might see that they might have more or less, because of hypotension, they might have fainting episodes, or extreme fatigue, or indigestion might be seen. And the chest pain does not come to the chest always. It might come to a lower abdomen also, and even nausea or vomiting. So not all the chest pain is because of heart attack. Not all the heart attack, so not all the vomitings is because of the abdominal issues. Sometimes the patient will have only vomitings and come to the hospital. The patient will be thinking she or he is just having only stomach disturbance, will end up with a heart attack. Whereas some patients will come with severe chest pain. We will find out that that is not the case, and it is because of the gas. So you need not take the decision, but chest pain along with breathlessness is a very important thing to work around. And even if the patient is having mild chest pain, if it is not working, especially in high risk patients like diabetic patients, you always have to get it to a hospital rather than just bring it out to precipitate later on. Coming to the topic is choking. This is called as Heimlich's maneuver, and it is a very life-saving technique which each and every one of us should know. Mainly, we see in children having choking. We as pulmonologists tend to have patients who have, especially pediatric age group, who have choked. The babies have choked on some food items or some toys. That is that we tend to have to do bronchoscopy to remove that object. Whereas if you are having a baby who is having choking, the bluish, they'll start feeling breathless, and they, because the baby can't tell what they're feeling, you will start seeing them turn blue because of the decrease in the oxygen level. So immediately they feel choking. The baby is choking on less than 1 year. You have to sit and kneel down and hold the baby face down and lower. Then you have to keep the head lower than the chest, and you have to give 5 fixes on behind the back, firm blows between the shoulder blades, so that the diaphragm will act and they will be able to push it out. And if this doesn't work, you have to turn around the baby, place 2 fingers in middle of the chest, above the nipple line, and give 5 thrust, 1%, like one per second. Repeat the sequence of 5 back flips, and you have to keep on doing that until the object is explained. Or if the baby becomes unresponsive, you have to directly take it to a hospital. For an adult, because the adult will be able to stand up and will be able to coordinate what you want, you have to immediately stand behind the patient, lock your arms, especially behind the just the navel. So you are trying to block it at the diaphragm level and grasp and try to press it with the sudden heavy motion, because that will help the diaphragm in expelling out the object. For pregnant women, because the pregnancy won't allow the patient to push around the stomach, you have to take it at around the chest. For all unconscious patients who have been choking it, that means that the oxygen level to the brain has gone down. That is why they have become unresponsive. Immediately you have to start the CPR and try it. If you are able to try to remove the, if you are able to get the, like I've already told in the first slide, you have to, if you are able to remove the foreign object from the mouth, it is better. But always start a CPR and uh, inform the emergency services to come and help you. And next topic will be related to neurological issues, that is stroke. This is again what we are seeing in hypertensive crisis. The patient will have elevated hypertension. Stroke has multiple causes, but the most common cause becomes hemorrhagic stroke because of which is of the BP, blood pressure. What we see is the patient having extreme elevation of the blood pressure, thereby causing the thin blood vessels of the brain bleeding out. So rapidly developing clinical signs of focal disturbance or cerebral function lasting more than 24 hours. The patient is excessively sleeping. The patient is had a projectile vomiting, immediately vomiting, sudden vomiting without any disturbance in the any like food disturbance or anything like that. Sudden vomiting, headache, and the most important thing is to identify fast. This is the take home message I want you to take. Fast is the face starts to look uneven because they will have unilateral paralysis. The muscles of the opposite side of the, if the right side of the brain is having a stroke, the left side of the face will tend to have the loss of facial movement. Then you have to ask them to, if they are able to rise their both arms. If they are able to rise their both arms, that means good. If they're not able to rise, that's another red flag. The third thing is, they, because of the loss of one side of the face as well as loss of the muscle supply, nerve supply to the muscles, they will not be able to properly communicate. They will have slurring of speech. These all three signs: face, arms, as well as speech. You have to identify it. And the earlier you identify it, the earlier the patient can be started on treatment. If it is a clot, the earlier, because brain tissue doesn't repair itself. What dead is dead, and even if it repairs, it will take a period of years together for it to recover. So if the recovery, if you take the patients within the golden period, that is around 1 hour, the patient can be started immediately on the treatment. That is, if there's a clot, the clot can be given anticoagulants where the clot can be broken up and the blood supply to the brain can come back. So if you see a patient of stroke at home, the paramount importance is to take him to the hospital. There's nothing much to be done at home. If you are seeing these signs in the patient, you have to take the patient to the hospital. Do not delay in any way. And the symptoms, what you see is sudden loss of motion and dribbling of saliva because the mouth has lost its contour, blurring of vision, flashing, confusion, disoriented, and sometimes unconscious. What to do patient if he's in unconscious? You have to place the patient on the right or left lateral position so that the tongue doesn't fall, and you have to, if he's conscious, you have to lie down on the with the head and shoulders raised, monitor, reassure, call the ambulance, resuscitate if the patient has collapsed. That is again the same thing comes: airway, breathing, and circulation. And again you have little bit discrepancies in male as well as female. The female might tend to have just general weakness, disoriented, fatigue, or nausea or vomiting, which we don't see generally in the males. And the other topic, next topic, is regarding seizures. Seizures is also something, when when a non-medico sees a seizure, he or she will be shocked, or they will be actually paralyzed by fear because they won't be able to do anything. And even as a medical professional, we have to identify if the patient is having going through a seizure. There is nothing much from a point of view that people tend to think. They tend to give keys, or they tend to press on the neck, they tend to do all sort of colloquial things what we have heard from our elders to do. But it is because of the abnormal electrical activity of the brain, and more or less the seizure will subside on its own. The only thing you have to do is, the patient should not either have not aspirate anything or should not have a tongue bite. But then again, don't go and put your hand in the mouth and try to prevent tongue bite, thereby biting your own hand. And if the patient is near something injurious, like some near some kitchen, or where there is fire, or on a workstation where there is a high risk behavior, you have to first remove the patient away from the fire, water, or furniture, which is the danger. Do not try to restrain. If you try to hold the patient, you cannot stop the muscle from flexing. So what will happen is, the muscles will be contracting. You will applying pressure for the contraction to stop. So what will happen is, there will be a bleeding occurring in the muscles causing a hematoma. So don't insert anything in the mouth. After convulsion cease, you turn the patient to the left lateral position and call for the emergency. Just have to see that because of the continuous secretions, uh, there will be a lot of saliva in the mouth. You have to try to clear it. Don't leave the position even after the seizure, because there is a concept called a status epilepticus. The patient might recurrently have these seizures. And these days, the patient there is a uh, dictum that we are also getting nasal sprays of midazolam, that even in case of emergency, if someone is having, they can spray in the nose, but you have to identify the dosage, and based on the body weight you have to give. You can't just give too many puffs. How do you identify a patient who is going to have a seizure? They will tend to have aura. That means they'll have little bit of photophobia, the little bit of headache, sudden rigidity of body, tonic flows. They'll suddenly collapse. They will have sudden tightening and loosening, tightening and loosening. If they are falling, they might have head injuries also. If they are around, if they are having any bowel and they will have bowel and bladder incontinence, which can be seen. And after the seizure has occurred, the patient will be totally exhausted. He will be in a confused or in a dazed state. Another thing I want you to identify over here is sometimes the patient will be just standing in front of you blindly. He'll be just his eyes will roll up and down like nystagmus, but it is just called as absent seizure. The patient will have an electrical activity in his brain, but not to a level that he will have tonic-clonic seizures, but that is also comes under seizures. That comes to an issue when the patient is driving. If he's a bus driver, having a absent seizure or partial seizure during driving might cause harm to all the people involved. So identifying these things is of high importance. And coming to the next topic, which is the pandemic major, I would like to take some time to discuss this topic. So pandemic, as we all know, since 2019, if in March, since March, we are having March 2020 in India, we have started seeing the first cases. Now, the pandemic, the first wave was different from the second wave. The second wave was even more horrible than the first wave, because patients are having a more, we have started learning more about the pandemic. On the other hand, the pandemic has also started changing its symptoms. Previously, only we used to, initially when we started having the pandemic, cough, breathlessness, chest tightness, or fever, body pains was the main symptoms. Then we started slowly having loose stools, pain abdomen. Then we have the big breakthrough symptom was loss of smell, which became pathognomonic, or sort of identifying point of pandemic, identifying part of COVID-19. Now it has come to a wide range. Now we are seeing a patient who just has mild headache. You get the RT-PCR done. They might be having other subclinical signs, but down the line he or she will develop COVID. So it is very hard to identify the COVID patient initially. But what I, as a pulmonologist, have started seeing is fever is something which you cannot mimic. Whereas uh, if you are having stuffy nose, little bit of cough, or you're having a little bit of runny nose, this can also occur because you might have a little bit of sinusitis, or you might be wearing a mask too tight, or you might be working in some cold environment. These are all something which might be overlapping with COVID. So you can't just label it as COVID. But then again, you can't just sit at home that thinking it's not COVID. Fever might be a breakthrough symptom, but you have to, identification is the key. And especially in elderly, I have seen in my own experiences, elderly patients, they tend to have decreased appetite, loss of appetite, as well as irritability in the early period only. So if you are able to, they won't have fever also. Unlike youngsters, because their immune system is quite weak, the elderly people don't even mount up a fever, thereby showing it as a sign. So you have to identify that the decreased appetite, loss of appetite, and body pains, generalized myalgia. These are worrisome. Is it COVID? Isn't COVID? It's better to isolate if you're having above symptoms, then get for a COVID test. You have two COVID tests right now. One is the RT-PCR, which is the gold standard even for now, and the second is RAT, that is rapid antigen test. Both no test is of 100% surety that it will be able to diagnose it, because I've seen patients whose RT-PCR will be negative, but they will be having symptoms. So I give the symptoms to the priority. Okay, never take a patient's RT-PCR level, because down the two slides down the line, I'll be teaching you how the pathogenesis and how the disease progresses in the body. So the first thing is to identify the symptom sign. The patient, all the reports are normal. The patient is suffering. There is no use of the reports. So first thing is to isolate if the patient starts having symptoms. Second thing is to go for the RT-PCR if the patient is having symptoms within 1 week. Third thing is if the RT-PCR is negative, get a basic lab test, that CBP, blood picture, or the other subclinical or the other basic test, which will indirectly point us towards the infection. So identification is the key in any disease. The issue regarding COVID-19 is, unlike other diseases, which tend to improve as the patient the days keeps on passing. For COVID, you have 3 phases. The first is the viral phase. I am going to teach you how it progresses to a patient having an ICU admission. Now, if you can have a look at this slide, so you see that initially the patient will have viral phase, that is around 1 to 7 days. Then he will start having the lung infiltrates, and the third is the inflammatory phase, which is called as the hyperimmune phase, or the patient going into a cytotoxic storm, or the patient ending up with the ICU. What is happening is the patient will initially have mild constitutional symptoms, that is fever, cough, diarrhea, headache in the earlier part of period. When the lungs start getting involved, there is a shortness of breath and the patient start getting breathless, and the respiratory symptoms like cough, breathlessness, expectoration will start increasing. And the third phase is acute respiratory distress syndrome. That is, the patient is going into respiratory failure, thereby causing the patient to land up in an ICU. As you can see, the course of infection is over a period of 2 weeks. But in the second wave, the first stage has rapidly progressed to second stage. Previously, we used to see the patients with mild symptoms and coming to the hospital with dry cough. Nowadays, directly the patients are ending up with the CT findings because the pulmonary stage is coming very rapidly because of the virulence of the virus, as well as the host immunity being less, thereby causing the patient to have rapid onset of symptoms, life-threatening symptoms. So identification is the key. Second thing, the monitoring. You have to monitor the oxygen levels. You have to monitor the temperature charting. And as you can see here, you have a viral phase in the initial part. So if until and unless till 14 days to 2 weeks, you can get a test done, you get a RT-PCR positive. After the second week, the virus starts to die. Or actually on the day 9, the virus stops replicating. So post second week, even if you get a test, it might come positive, it might come negative. So, but the damage has already been done. So this is the part in which you start antivirals. And once the inflammation response starts, that is inflammatory issue starts up, that is where the body starts overreacting to the virus damage. That is where we have to use steroids. Okay. Are you able to hear me properly, everyone? If there is any issue.
Yes, yes. It's very clear, sir.
Okay. So the viral response phase is the phase in which you use the antiviral. You might have heard about remdesivir, the antiviral which we have been using since the past almost 1 year. Initially, we didn't have any antiviral. We just used to wait for the patient to his own immune system kicking in and helping us out. But nowadays, we have the help of antivirals as well as steroids. But the main thing I want you to take home is you don't start the steroids in the initial period. So what happens if you start steroids in the initial period? If you start the steroids in the first week, what happens? The virus will get help because we are decreasing our immune system and asking the virus to grow. So we only start the virus on the second week, or if the patient is already having less oxygen level, the oxygen level is decreasing to a level that we require oxygen to be given to the patient. That time it is also warranted for the oxygen steroids to be given. Either the patient has crossed 1 week of infection, or his blood parameters are increasing, that is the CRP or the other inflammatory factors. And the third thing is, if he's having decrease in oxygen level, that means you have to start the steroid. But all these decisions are changing from case to case. In COVID-19, there is no clear-cut scenario that this patient should be given this, that patient can be given that. You have guidelines, but it depends on each and every patient. Each patient is not equal to the other patient. Okay, so based on their condition, because you have the patients having medications and other thing at home right now because of the vast disinformation or misinformation going around, the patients tend to have a lot of alternative medicines as well as they themselves taking home remedies, which is causing the patient to have not the symptoms what we see in our textbooks. We tend to see the patient with mixed pictures. He'll go to a local consultant who will tell that he's having typhoid, then he'll get treated for that, then he'll at the end of the day when he land up with ICU, already the symptoms have progressed to a level that he's already into hyperinflammatory stage. In that time, only the steroids as well as other NSAIDs are the only thing which we have. Okay. And so how do you distinguish that the patient is having mild, moderate, severe? You yourself might have gone through the COVID almost, because it's going to become endemic over a period of time. I've seen patients, families having COVID and recovering. Those patients who are more than 80, more than 65 years tend to have a severe disease. It basically, end of the day, it depends on the inflammatory and the viral load. It is a very thin balance which will be maintained, and it depends on the what happens at a molecular level. So you might be seeing elderly. I've seen elderly patients. I've treated a 92-year-old patient who came out well. I've seen a 16-year-old boy, 20-year-old boy dying with COVID. So it depends on the viral load, how much amount of the virus has infected you, and your response, and how at what time you end up in the hospital. I would always prefer a patient to start on antivirals at an urgency, because you are closing the floodgates for the virus to progress. So once you decrease the viral load in your body, then you are not going to go for a you are not going to go end up with an inflammatory reaction. The less the virus, the less the inflammation. The less the inflammation, the less the use of steroids also. So mild illness, the patient will not be presenting with the clinical features, or they will have only upper respiratory tract infection and have a stable picture. This is mostly which I had seen in first wave. Second wave, majority of the patients, they are not even able to tolerate the viral symptoms. That is, body pains are so severe. I've seen youngsters crying because of the body pain. 20-25-year-old, because they're not able to, because this is basically due to the virus causing inflammation in the body, thereby causing cytokines to come inside your muscles, causing the body pain. And now moderate illness, the patient will be have illness, the patient will be having respiratory or some signs, but oxygen level is the primary importance over here. And the second, third things will the other apart from the mild illness, moderate, severe, and critical illness will be seen based on the oxygen levels. The patient will have all the viral symptoms, that is severe weakness, fever, X-ray showing the pulmonary involvement, but the labs will be normal and the patient will be maintaining a good oxygen level. This means the patient is having moderate. Meaning the patient has lung infection, but the patient is under control. Once the patient goes into severe cytotoxic storm or the third stage, the respiratory rate starts increasing, oxygen levels start decreasing, and when you do an arterial blood gas, the oxygen level keeps on decreasing to a rapid level. The last thing is respiratory failure, or the lungs stop working, because what is happening is in COVID, once the COVID viruses goes, our body starts hyperreacting, and our alveoli, which you know, are filled with our exudative fluid. That is how we have a swelling in our arm whenever an insect bites, not to an allergic reaction sort of way, but as a inflammatory reaction. How you see, you might seen in the second year pathology, rubor, tumor, Calor, Doller. These are all signs of inflammation. Similar inflammation will occur in the lung, thereby causing the lungs to be filled up with fluid. This fluid prevents the oxygen from coming inside your lungs and going. So thereby causing a decrease in the oxygen level. The patient will be drowning in his own fluids, thereby needing the ventilator to be put. Ventilator is another support which will help pushing air inside your lungs on the first side, and second thing is giving us time, valuable time for the patient to recover on its own and the medications to kick in. Mind you, all the medications we give will take at least 48 hours to kick in. You don't see a patient coming in giving the medication, he'll be just sitting up. You will have at least 48 hours of time for the medicine to get absorbed in your body, then the activity of the medicine kicking in. So that is why we are seeing patients who are coming up later, second week, with severe inflammatory markers. That time antivirals won't be helping us, because the virus is already caused and gone. You might not even find sometimes patients having RT-PCR negative at that point of time. So that time only our mainstay will steroids with other supportive treatment. That is non-invasive ventilator, or the patient might require invasive ventilator. And as all medical thing, we know that each and every insult to the lung will end up with lung scarring. So all the COVID patients, at whatever severity they might be having, they might end up with lung damage, permanent or temporary. And as the pandemic is progressing, we have a newer concept nowadays. You might be seeing that COVID patients who had been recovered, they go home with some oxygen, because their lung have damage to a level that they can't breathe normal oxygen without taking supplementary oxygen. That might be temporary, like 3 to 4 weeks, or sometimes it might progress to lifetime if the damage is more than 60%. Sometimes the patient will end up with ventilator at home. Sometimes you see patients recovering beautifully, but you tend to see that the other symptoms like fatigue, weakness, myalgias, and all these tend to have over a period of time. And I am seeing a lot of patients coming back with other infections also. That is because of the steroid use. Sometimes because the patient is having poor sugar control, high sugar levels, and steroid being used aggressively, they might be ending up with mucormycosis. That is the other fungal infection what we are seeing nowadays. So all these things can be prevented by just identifying the patient at an earlier point of view. And what tends to happen is those patients who have mild infection, they tend to tell other patients that, okay, it is just a upper respiratory tract infection, mildly I've gotten one. Each and every case is different. I would prefer a patient to be always there under medical consultant to have a sort of home treatment or whatever treatment is. Out of 100 patients, 85% of the patients can be treated at home with proper monitoring. What we tend to do is the first week happens, we go for the lab analysis. That is, if there is any unlike other diseases, COVID causes blood clotting, which is not seen in other diseases, as well as this. Uh, Sorry for sort of extending the time period I've been given. So let us move to the next topic. And oh, as I've given the question previously, how does it progress to an ICU admission? Previously, we used to see the patient having slowly progressed from this to this. Nowadays, the patient is coming at this level, moderate illness, and it doesn't have any much buffer zone to go to a critical illness, or they'll come at the time where there is no use of the remdesivir or any antiviral. So always identify at an earlier point, start viral at the earliest, monitor your oxygen levels, and I'm going to tell you how to monitor at home. And the medical equipment, I wanted all of you to have this: the thermometer, a pulse oximeter, a BP apparatus, a glucometer. The newest approach, what I am doing for my patients, and I'm planning to do a research work also on this, is to have a 6-minute walk test. What you tend to do is, for a patient who will be telling that he's not having any symptoms, or a COVID patient, if you are checking the oxygen saturation as well as the heart rate, initial when the patient is at rest, then you ask the patient to walk around a limited area. Like you identify 10 feet area, you ask the patient to walk around that area for 6 minutes. You note down how much oxygen level they are getting after the walking. Second thing is to measure how many rounds they have walked and see if they are any breathless after that. You keep on doing it at a daily routine. So the what happens is, because of this test, you will be able to identify those patients whose lung has damage to a level, but they are not breathless at rest. So once you're asking them to walk around, they will get exerted and the oxygen will come on dipping. Once you see that the oxygen level is dipping more than 2 to 3, that means that more or less the patient in the next 24 hours or the 48 hours might have a lung damage progressing. Or it is always best to get a CT scan, or sorry, not CT scan, you have to directly show it to a medical consultant at that time, because oxygen level dipping is a very important sort of a breakthrough area. Once the oxygen starts decreasing, we have to go even more aggressively. I would prefer the patient to be started on IV antivirals if it is possible, or even more strict monitoring. Okay, 6-minute walk test is of paramount importance nowadays, because the patient can't keep on getting blood test every now and then. So once we are able to identify that he's not able to walk the same level as he was doing, because COVID is not an overnight disease, it is a disease which has its increasing or decreasing trends. So daily, if you are checking this, you will be able to identify and take a decision at an earlier point of view compared to other patient who will wait to a level that he become breathless at rest. So the earlier you identify, the better we'll be able to treat him. And coming to something regarding the other topic which I was talking, the patient has collapsed, the patient is unresponsive. You want to identify the patient is, you have to give CPR. That's the there. But again, during COVID era, you can't give mouth-to-mouth breathing. You can't give other things. So if you are able to identify the patient who is having peripheries cold, you have to check for the pulse. If the pulse is not having any heart, then you check for the heartbeat. If there's no heartbeat, you try to like wake him up, or try to check his pupils. If the pupils are fixed or they are moving That means the patient is alive, CPR can be continued. No, the pupils are dilated. That means they are going become bigger. You are seeing mydriatic pupils which are not. That means the patient has had some major event, and it is always because death or something like that. We can't just declare. Even in hospitals with ECGs, you have to have evidence to declare it. So you have to identify the patient as collapsed. These are all what I'm trying to teach over here is these are all the signs you have to identify and push the patient to the hospital. Not these things like that doesn't mean the patient without the signs also will not be requiring hospital care. You have to identify what level of help you can do. The only thing is you have to identify if you're finding any positive symptoms, what I've told you previously, like how the sugar levels, patient tends to most of the patients tend to leave it aside. They feel it as a common symptom, but that will get serious down the line. So that is the main aim, to push them to the hospital if you're requiring or getting a proper medical attention. Nowadays, a lot of teleconsultations are occurring, a lot of doctors are available online. It is always better to get medical attention as and when required. And last slide, I want to talk about the vaccination. Each and every one of us, and mostly, hopefully, majority of you have had vaccinations done. Now, currently, we have 4 vaccinations, out of which Moderna is still not available in India. This is being given in the Western countries. This is a encapsulated mRNA with the efficacy of 94%. Again, the main issue regarding this vaccine is it has a very less temperature of storage, that is minus 20 degrees, which is very hard to keep. That is why it is not that much used right now. And the dosage is 2 doses. You have to give 28 days apart, because the first dose you give it as a first dose, then the second dose is for the booster dose for the immunity to kick in back. Second is Covaxin, which you all might be hearing, Bharat Biotech. It is again 81 of efficacy, and again the doses are 28 days apart. There you have already seen that the storage level is +2 8. This is why it is easily viable to be kept in India and is available in India right now. The third vaccine is after Oxford AstraZeneca, which again is this data is around March. So nowadays the vaccination gap has been increased from 12 weeks to 16 weeks right now. 3 months are also they are asking us to take. The same thing. Again, you see that the vaccine can be stored at a better temperature, 2 to 8 degrees, and it has a good efficacy. The main thing I wanted to tell you right now is any vaccination is good enough. Any vaccine is good enough. Okay. They will have their own plus minus, but any vaccine is good enough in preventing the patient to have preventing against the patient having any severe infection. Vaccinated doesn't mean that the patient will not end up with hospital or end up with getting a pneumonia. It will only see that the patient will not get a severe form of pneumonia because the immune system is already ready for the virus to happen. So even if the patient gets infected, it might be a very mild infection which can be managed at home or maximum to an oxygen level. I've not seen patients who end up in ICU compared to those patients who have not vaccinated at all. Even one vaccination is helping out the patient compared to patients who have not been vaccinated. The newer vaccine, what we have started recently in India is Sputnik vaccine, which is a viral vector vaccine, similar to Oxford Zeneca. And it again has 91%. And it again has a temperature of 2 to 6 degrees, thereby helping in the ease of keeping in storage. And again, the doses are around 3 weeks apart, which might be again changed by the government of India. So I think my topic has come to an end. I would like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity for helping you out. And
thank you, sir. It was a really good, it was a really pleasure to have you with us. I am having few doubts. Students have messaged me. And the first doubt is that which are the basic tests that should be prescribed to a patient who is a suspected COVID patient?
Okay. Basic test would be differing from a patient who is a youngster to an elderly patient, because for a youngster, I wouldn't tend to get a liver function as a renal function test done, because more or less he will have normal levels. But still, for documentation's sake, you have to get done that. The first thing will be to go for a complete blood picture to identify that if there is any increase in the viral white blood cells, or in the earlier phase, you will find that the white blood cells will be less in amount. That means that the patient is having viral infection. Later on, that will come back to normal post second week. So the CBP mostly seeing the white blood cells as well as the platelet count, because COVID will cause thrombocytopenia. There will be clumping of the platelets, so you might see a decrease in the platelet levels also. And I've seen patients with co-infection with dengue as well as COVID. So you can have complete blood picture, CRP, that is an inflammatory marker, C-reactive protein. Then you can have ferritin, serum ferritin, LDH, lactose dehydrogenase will tell us how much amount of cell death is occurring. Higher the LDH in an earlier point of time, we'll be able to identify that the patient might go into fibrosis down the line. And along with that, don't go for a CT scan on day one. Don't go for an RT-PCR on day one, because if you get an RT-PCR on day one, it might come positive, it might come mostly negative. Day 3 to day 5, on after the symptom onset, will be more better time to get a this thing done, RT-PCR. But still, if it is available at an earlier point and the symptoms are high and you won't get a hospitalization earlier, you get it done as soon as possible. Go for RT-PCR rather than going for antigen test, because RT-PCR itself has 30% false negative. The antigen test has even more false negative. So always go for a RT-PCR done. Coming to the CT scan, always better to get it done on the 7th day. If the patient is mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic, mildly symptomatic only, I won't ask the patient to get a CT scan if the patient is not having any respiratory symptoms. No, if the patient is having symptoms and very sick, you can get it done on day 7. Day 7, you'll have a proper picture in which the pulmonary infiltrates are there. But as I've already told you, unlike the previous wave, the lung infiltrates are coming at an earlier point of time. So there's no hard and fast rule to get at a particular date. Once the respiratory symptoms start occurring, get it done. Next question.
And next question, another question I had, like one of my good student from GDC Hyderabad, Dr. Mandita. She's asking that sir, why has the plasma therapy and the remdesivir been removed from the treatment plan of COVID patients?
Again, plasma therapy, we had a concept that theoretically what we thought, because nowadays we did 6 to 7 research projects in Gandhi last year, out of which we what happens is theoretically something will look right, but when it comes to practice, that won't kick in. Okay. So the plasma therapy, the similar thing happened. So you have plasma to a level, you give the plasma to a patient, and you expect that the plasma antibodies present in the plasma will kick out the virus. But the patients getting the plasma therapy after the 2nd week, where already the virus is dead, is not helpful. Same comes in the stage for remdesivir. Remdesivir is not useful if the patient is being given in the 2nd week or 3rd week. That is the average time for the patient to come to the hospital right now. Okay. So when you are looking at a statistic level, that doesn't help us out. But this being removed at a guideline point of view, but depends on the each and every patient. I have seen remdesivir working beautifully in patients, but started early. Plasma therapy, since initial period only, I have not seen that high level of improvement being seen. So statistically, it was found to be insignificant. That is why whenever they do a research work or a thing, study, they will try to identify risk benefit ratio. They will asking the patient to go around, get that blood, but go through all the procedure. The benefit is not even good, that there's no use of putting that. Same thing stands for remdesivir also.
So another few questions I'm having, sir.
Please.
Student, Soumya from GDC Hyderabad, she's asking that, should we take any tablets after getting vaccinated? Is it like for a diabetic patient? Because most of the elders in our family, everyone is on they're having hypertension or diabetic. So is there any specific medication that we should take after or pre-COVID vaccines like that?
Actually, the vaccine, once you take the vaccine, a little amount of viral load will be in there. Sorry, it will mount an immune response. You will have body pains, you will have fever, you will have all the symptoms. The only thing I would ask you to do is to just have paracetamol. That's the safest drug we can have. You don't go for any other medication, because I've seen patients taking a lot of painkillers because of these body pains. Painkillers again in diabetic patients or hypertensive patients, again because diclofenac and these medicines are painkillers are nephrotoxic. That is, they harm the kidneys. So you don't take that medication. I would, if you're asking me safely for a broad spectrum of patients, to always paracetamol for me. Don't take any other medication as such for the vaccine. Post-vaccine body pains or post-vaccine any symptoms, it is always better to take only paracetamol.
And sir, regarding that blood donation, sir, like because of right now what we are having regarding this blood donation, if someone has taken a vaccine, he
Mhm.
cannot go for a blood donation. So could you clear upon that something?
So I also had this doubt. The antibodies and antigens and this sort of thing. I think I'll have to go regarding that little bit and get back to you. I think I'll do a little bit research regarding that and get back to you for that. Because I have also been getting those messages that go before vaccination, go give blood because we're going to have a lot of decrease in the amount of blood in our blood banks because post-COVID vaccinated blood is not that helpful or something related to that. But I think I'll need to work up a little bit regarding that and I'll get back to you.
And one thing, sir, like, is there any specific condition that vaccines are contraindicated, especially for like COVID vaccine? Because right now we are having very much sort of like in our own family members, they are
Yeah.
getting confused. A lactating baby, a lactating mother, can she go for
Nowadays,
vaccine?
newer guidelines are telling lactating mothers are to be given vaccination without anything. Uh, they used to tell that you have relative contraindication as well as absolute contraindication. Absolute contraindication currently is because pediatric age group less than 18 years, they are absolutely contraindicated because there is no research work done right now. And they are mostly getting milder type of viruses. That is why they are not preferred to get vaccinated right now. If you are going with relative contraindication, that is the patient being on blood thinners. Because there's another guideline for that. Once the patient is on blood thinner, you give a vaccine, you will have bleeding at the site or you have clots around that. So you have to identify that. Some patients are on aspirin, they are also having some clots. Or some patients, immunocompromised patients, they are also sort of had relative risk, but now those patients are preferred. All the immunocompromised patients are the priority to be given. The only thing, absolutely contraindication would be that pregnant females are not being included right now. Down the line, they might be because a lot of research work is going on right now. Now they are doing research work on Covaxin plus Covishield, as in the patient are being given Covaxin as well as Covishield, the booster dose. And when the studies come back, can these vaccines be interchanged? Can that be done? And all these that will all be seen. I would not go think about too much regarding that. If the patient is due for vaccination, go to the center. If the patient's the vaccination center guide tells you that this is so and so doesn't come under the purview of vaccines, that is that. But absolute contraindication, I won't tell as such currently, apart from the youngsters and pregnant females. But that keeps
And
on getting updated. I'll just put you a guideline what we have got from the government down.
okay, okay. And lastly, sir, if I'm not taking much of your time, and last doubt I'm getting from many students from this side, like one of our good student Nikita Mohan from Albada, she's asking that what can we like opportunistic infections or mucormycosis?
Yeah.
Like what, like something little upon that?
Mucormycosis, if you're asking me, mucormycosis, I've seen first wave. I've never seen a mucormycosis in the first cycle. We have been using steroids. But now the question what we are begging right now is what still we don't know the etiology. People are telling me, I've seen people telling because of steroids, people telling because of immunocompromised levels, people telling because of the oxygen like concentrators or something. All these theories are going around. But neither anything can be denied nor anything can be accepted right now. One thing I would see that is what we are seeing is mucormycosis is a commensal which will be seen everywhere in our body. Okay, you can't stay away from these kind of spores. But previously, prior to COVID, I had only seen mucormycosis in on HIV patients to a level that their CD4 counts, that is, their immunity is gone to such a level low that they don't tend to have this. Okay, they are not even able to mount immune response against this. Okay, so that kind of cases with severe immunocompromised levels I'm seeing. Now, again, the cases of mucormycosis are increasing. So we have to do a proper study to identify the etiology. But all these etiologies said and done can be taken under consideration or hypothesis, which are being circulated right now. So the patient is not requiring oxygen, no need to put him on oxygen and try to sterilize the mask as we can. try to keep the sugar levels at the minimum. But coming to the case of steroid is the only way we have been treating COVID. So judicious usage of steroid is another thing what we are doing, and identification at an earlier onset. So the patient is prolongedly given steroids or not even immunocompromised level is persistently low. The immunity is quite low. Patient start the identification is the key again there, because mucormycosis is more than just antifungal. It is more sort of just removing the fungus from your body, because it progresses rapidly. Especially what signs you have to look in a patient post COVID is swelling of your cheek or pain in your cheek sinuses around your frontal as well as your maxillary sinus, drooping of your eye, swelling of your eyelid, as well as little bit of epistaxis, like bleeding from your nose. Okay, you're having black sputum, black secretions coming from your nose, ear pain, tooth pain also. Tooth infection can also progress upstairs. And all these things you have to identify at an earlier point of view so that the antifungals can kick in. Thereby, if you're able to get a biopsy or the FES, what we are doing right now, the ENT surgeons are doing FES surgeries and taking a sinus biopsy as well as conjunctival biopsy. They are doing to identify that the fungal uh, origin is present or not. So until and unless we are having a proper concept of the etiology, I think uh, being aware of all the causes is like sort of prevention for the mucormycosis from coming.
Sir,
Because
regarding the,
yeah,
like, irrespective of the article knowledge, if I say, what is like mucormycosis? Is it stuck to like any sort of particular specific age group, like above 40 age group
yeah,
people are only
yeah,
affected? Out of
yeah.
your experience?
Elderly patients with poor diabetic control, poor oral hygiene, with chronic recurrent sinus issues, with especially bad oral hygiene and like even self hygiene also in that case. These are all the high risk vulnerable groups, and thereby just reusing of these masks or having a lot of humidity as well as lot of patients tend to, because patients tend to these funguses tend to grow in a lot of soaked wet moisty areas. You are having a lot of moisture in your house, in your walls, in your surroundings, as well as having a lot of humidity in the air. These are all the signs which help the virus in fungus to grow. And especially in diabetic patients, because the sugar levels are low, sugar levels are high, and this sugar levels itself acts as a food for these funguses. These people are most vulnerable, as well as immunocompromised patients, like those patients who are already on steroids, long-term steroids like renal transplants and other things. But you still tend to see those patients having sporadic virus also. Sporadic cases in youngsters also we have been seeing. But elderly people and more than 65 diabetic people with poor sugar control remain the main age group.
So, sir, so I before concluding, one last question from Gunjan. Like, she's asking that suppose we have already taken one vaccine, can we go for another effective vaccine? Like after some time, if we find some effective one, so can we go for it?
Currently, by the guidelines, if you are going, because everything is linked to Aadhaar card right now, even your RT-PCR report, even your vaccination is linked to that. Current guidelines don't allow you to intermix with other vaccine, because as I've already told, Bharat Biotech will have a vaccine who is, I'll just show it to you, because the vaccine component of the vaccine will be different in different. Uh, Encapsulated mRNA virus is seen in Moderna. Inactivated virus vaccine is seen in Bharat Biotech. So you see a vaccine, you have an immune response. Okay. Whereas Moderna, you see that the only protein is going and that is causing an immune response. And coming to Oxford Genica, you are seeing a viral vector vaccine. So you are seeing a spike that causing an immune response. You are nowadays what is available is Covaxin as well as Covishield. Both have a different immune response which they cause, but unique over here. virus, human cell will be infected by adenovirus that will cause a DNA. DNA will cause spike protein that will give immune response. Coming to the other thing, you directly have the virus, inactivated virus, thereby giving immune response. So as the mechanism is different, so currently the guidelines don't allow us to infect cross having two different set of vaccines. That is what I'm trying to tell you. The research regarding this can exchange vaccines. It comes up that they then might issue again. But one thing is always follow the whatever the guidelines the government is following. Informally taking a vaccine won't be helpful for us. Second thing is um, they might, because newer strains are coming up, newer viruses are coming up, they might keep on updating the viral database in the vaccine. So we might in future see a newer vaccine which will be sort of supportive for the and prevent the infection from newer strains of viruses, because uh, the older strains are less virulent right now and the newer strains are coming up. Like we have seen a Delta variant, that is the Indian variant right now, with number of mutations. The viruses keep on mutating. We also, as vaccine, also have to start getting upgraded as the time keeps on going.
And last thing, sir, because the third wave they are telling, one Anugrah student is asking that the theory on third primary target, will it be children below 12 years? What is the data regarding that? What you are seeing at the current scenario?
Would be that epidemiologists are telling us that it be there. Obviously, what happened in the first wave and the second wave is that we are seeing patients with majority of the patient babies getting involved, but they not having any severe infections because the receptor of the SARS-CoV virus is H2 receptor. H2 receptor is especially seen more in adults. It is not that much projected in the children age group. So that is why the virus is not able to cling on it and progress, whereas it is able to progress rapidly in adults. So that is one thing why the virus is not seen causing that much damage in the adults. On the other hand, they are predicting that third wave might be coming in pediatrics because of the epidemiologists doing that research on their own line. But I would prefer to see how it is going to happen in the UK right now, because what we are seeing is UK tends to. We had COVID in Europe, had COVID in December. We had in March, so we are running a little bit 4 months late behind them. So how, based on how it comes, data starts flowing in, we'll be able to identify. But the hospitals have started prepping up in Telangana. Already, Nilofer Hospital has been targeted, kept as a nodal center. So we will wait till it comes. Nowadays, in the second wave, pediatric age group have become the most common carriers of the virus. They going around infecting each other with mild infection, but when it comes to adults, they're causing life-threatening infections. So intermingling of kids should be put down, and just we have to wait and watch right now. Theory is going around like that. Time will only tell.
So one more doubt, sir. I am very sorry. Vaccine, can it be given to a dialysis patient, sir?
It has been included, I think. He comes, or he or she comes an immunocompromised patient, I think he will be given a priority over others, I think.
Okay.
But the patient should not be having, the main issue regarding vaccination is the patient should not be concomitantly suffering from some infection. Like you're already immunocompromised. Over that, you're suffering from some infection. You have to wait out. Currently, if you're having COVID, you can't take any vaccine because you're already your immunity will be having that virus antibodies. So you have to wait for 3 months. Like that, generally, what we have a dictum is if the patient is already infected by some other virus or has hospitalized or has recently been recovering from other illnesses which required hospitalization, we have to wait another 4 weeks. But that again tends to change from each patient to patient.
So I think how many days? Sir, one more question. Like this one is very important. After like some patient who has gone through COVID and all, after how many days he should take vaccine?
Currently, they are telling a dictum of 3 months. Currently, the government has put a guideline that 16 weeks or 3 months should 3 months to be the time period in which the vaccine.
After someone who has turned positive.
Yeah. But I think I'll share you. Yeah, I'll share the guidelines with you after some time, I think.
Probably if you what all data you want to share with the students, you can forward it to me. I'll forward it to the convey to
Yeah,
the
because
students.
that is the FAQ sort of thing I'm seeing these days, because government is keeping 18 weeks, because whatever guidelines are there, even if you want to get vaccinated, they won't give you the vaccine because everything is linked with Aadhaar card right now. So they'll ask you to wait another 3 months to get it done.
And sir, lastly, which is the vaccine that you have taken, and what would you suggest, like Sputnik V or COVID Shield?
If you're asking me, all the vaccine are more or less equal. Just getting the vaccination is most important thing right now. Which works, which doesn't work. End of the day, everything has their mechanism of action. You have seen 81, 94, all these things are statistical data. But vaccination is the prior important. Whatever you're able to get your hands on ASAP would be preferred. If you're having any international travel, right now, Covaxin has not got the approval internationally to be accepted as a vaccine. Vaccinated person can't travel with Covaxin, but hopefully that approval might be coming in the coming days. Currently, AstraZeneca, Moderna are the vaccines which are having their approval. Moderna, as usual, is not available in India right now. So AstraZeneca, that is Covishield, is currently the vaccine which is sort of approved for international travel. If there's no international travel, if you're having that, getting your hands on Covaxin, go ahead with that. Whatever vaccine comes your hand, take it. That would be preferred. There's no preferred vaccine right now because more or less everything is same. Because immune response is the main priority what we need to have right now. Because you sitting and waiting for the Covishield to getting, you might be having Covaxin in your supply. You're waiting for Covishield. Till that time, Covaxin might get an approval. You might be losing this and that also. And meantime, you'll get an infection. So the life is of the primary paramount importance. So whatever vaccine you are able to get your hands on, whatever is available near you, go ahead and get vaccinated.
So I think most of the students have like know a clear basic topic of like what is COVID they can understand, and they have concluded that as soon as possible they have to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much, sir, that you have said so much about vaccine and so much about COVID and so much about medical emergencies and how to handle it. So it was a really great.
Yeah, I'm actually very happy to be a part of this whole thing. It's been a while. COVID has stopped me from teaching. So it's been a while since me taking class. Okay. So thank you all
so much
for helping me out in this way.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you.